All right, so I want to start with a quote from Mervyn Maxwell. Some of you might have read his commentaries on Daniel Revelation called God Cares. And I thought he summarized Daniel 11 and its nature pretty well. So talking about Daniel 11 and the prophecies here, he says, there are no multi-element images, no beasts or horns, just the same. Its language is far from easy. It is cryptic, almost like a code. Each sentence condenses quantities of information. Many metaphors are employed. Many pronouns do not seem at first to have clear antecedents. The underlying Hebrew presents problems. So calculus. So we talked a little bit last time about how the book of, how chapter 11 is a little bit different in the book of Daniel, where we're in the prophetic portion of this vision and dialogue that Daniel has. There's not this vision with images. It seems to be an explanation, but the explanation is almost harder to understand than the visions that we've encountered previously. And we talked a little bit about some things just to help us have some tools to work with as we go to interpret Daniel 11. We talked about the literary structure. So remember, there's this back and forth nature: attack from the south, attack from the north, attack from the south, attack from the north, attack from the south, attack from the north. But there's also these parallels between the attack from the south in 5 through 8, the attack from the north in 13 to 25, and ultimately we have the final conflict between the north and the south in 40 to 45. Because what we see the south doing in 5 through 8, we see the north kind of doing in 13 to 25. It kind of is a bit of a puzzle. We talked about how do you interpret this, because if they were just strictly parallel, you could think they're talking about the same event, but we've got the roles are reversed in these parallel sections. We also talked about just how you can see this back and forth nature. This is Daniel 11 with the verses referring to the king of the south highlighted in pink, the verses referring to the king of the north highlighted here in yellow. And of course, what should stand out to us very quickly is which of those is the chapter primarily about? The north. The focus is very much on the king of the north. Josh, would you be willing to go back and shut the doors there in the back? The Waterbrook Church, just those doors. The Waterbrook Church has a women's group that's meeting, and I just hope we're not bothering them. And then we talked about how verse 27, you see here it's not highlighted in pink or yellow. It's about both of these kings, and we'll look at that again. But really, for me, that's the theological and thematic center of Daniel 11. This verse summarizes the overall message of Daniel 11. Remember, it says both these kings' hearts are bent on evil. They sit at the same table, but they're not going to prosper. Their end's going to be at the appointed time. And I think this is the bigger message of Daniel 11. We also talked about the parallels between Daniel 8 and 11. Remember, they have the same scope. They begin with in the time of the Medes and Persians. They go to the time of the end. And then we saw all these connections between the little horn and the king of the north. And we won't go through all of those in detail, but clearly the same language, some of these same identifying characteristics, the same activities of the little horn in Daniel 8 happens with and through the king of the north in Daniel 11. And so my interpretation is that the king of the north is to be identified the same as the little horn with the governing body of the church during the medieval period, the papacy. Now, with that said, how you determine or interpret the little horn in Daniel 8 is really going to determine what you do with the king of the north in Daniel 11. So those who interpret the little horn in Daniel 8 as being Antiochus Epiphanes, when they get to Daniel 11 and they get to the king of the north, they see the king of the north as Antiochus Epiphanes. All right, is everybody with me so far? Questions, comments, thoughts? Remember, we also looked at some kind of waypoints in Daniel 11. We saw through the first 4 verses, hey, they were pretty easy. Verse 22 was a clear reference to Jesus. We saw these activities of the little horn in verse 36 and other places. And by verse 40, we are at the time of the end.
So when we're going through Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, it seems like it works its way to the little horn.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really talked much about the king of the south in the book of Daniel, have we?
With who we're going to identify as the king of the south. No, I think the king of the south in Daniel 11 is kind of a new character on the scene. And, again, they're not emphasized in chapter 11, but they are, in a sense, I think, there to be an opposite and an enemy and a counter to the king of the north, right? They're there almost for the sake of comparison and, highlighting their conflict with the king of the north. But,
okay.
And we'll get to that a little bit more as we go on. Okay, so what I want to do very, very quickly is I want to just walk you through 4 basic interpretations of Daniel 11. We're going to get into the weeds here in just a minute, but before we get into the weeds, I want you to understand with me a little bit about how different schools of thought approach the king of the north, the king of the south, these different elements in Daniel 11. So we're going to look at basically 4 different ways of thinking, and then I'll let you know which one of those my brain lines up with mostly. You might have a different opinion. That's perfectly fine. So remember, the preterist school of interpretation is the idea that the prophecies had their primary fulfillment in the time of the prophet, in the time that they were written. So that the prophecies are about the immediate time period around which the book was written. And so the preterists would interpret the book of Daniel as having been written not in Babylon, but during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. They would also interpret Revelation as primarily about what's going on with the Roman Empire during John's time and early Christianity. So the preterists would, everybody agrees on verses 1 through 4, all the schools of thought, and almost everybody agrees really on verses 13, maybe down through 20, somewhere in there. So the preterists would see verses 5 and 13, the king of the south and the king of the north, king of the south being the Ptolemies, king of the north being the Seleucids. We'll talk a little bit more about who they are, leading up to Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 14, really all the way down through verse 39. And then this is where they say the prophecies in verses 40 through 45 are wrong. The author of Daniel got it wrong. And in fact, if you compare verses 40 to 45 to Antiochus Epiphanes, those verses don't really fit. They just don't really match with his end and his life and everything. They're just, they're not really a good fit. And so what a preterist would say is, well, that tells us when the book of Daniel was written, because he got everything right in Antiochus's life until the last few years. That means that he must have been writing history for the, verses 1 to 39, but verses 40 to 45, he's making actual predictions. And of course, because he doesn't know the future, he gets those predictions wrong. And so this is why most critical scholars date the book of Daniel to 167 BC, because they say Daniel 11 is right up till about 167, and then it starts going off the rails, and so we must know it was written at that time because prophets can't really know the future. So that's the preterist interpretation. Everything happening primarily in the time of the prophet, and they believe that Daniel was written not during the exile in Babylon, but in Judea around the time of Antiochus. The futurists look toward a primarily future fulfillment in the end of time for the prophecies. So they would agree really all the way up through about verse 35. So they, Persia, Alexander the Great, king of the south, king of the north of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, Antiochus III, Antiochus IV. But when they get to verse 36, they say the prophecy now jumps till the end of time. And so now we're not talking about Antiochus anymore. These verses don't really fit that well. And so we're talking about a future Antichrist who's going to come and do similar sorts of things there in the temple in Jerusalem, the literal temple there, that the temple's going to be rebuilt. And so they see all of this being fulfilled by a future Antichrist. Now keep in mind, what this does, though, is it puts, a more than 2,000 year gap right here between these verses. So they say, without anything in the text indicating this gap, we jump from Antiochus being the king of the north to 2,000 years later to a future Antichrist who's going to be the king of the north. Questions, comments, thoughts about the preterist and futurist schools of interpretation? So most commentaries that you read, if you go to the library, a university library or something, and pull a commentary off the shelf, most commentaries that you read are going to be the preterist genre, preterist school of thought. Some of them will be futurist. The last school of interpretation, the historicist school of interpretation, this is the one that I subscribe to. This is the one that I believe best fits the text, is the least popular among biblical scholars today.
Really?
Yes, it is. And there's a whole history, I believe, why that is. I think some of the things that it points toward steps on our toes, as Christians, right?
Yes.
It's, taking a look at what happened during the Middle Ages and in Christendom, and it's not giving a favorable opinion of these things. And so I believe that primarily because of that, this has fallen out of favor. So what I'm going to show you here is just two historicist modes or methods of looking at Daniel chapter 11. These are primarily the two primary ways that if you read a historicist author, they're going to interpret Daniel 11. Now remember, the historicist school of thought believes that the prophecy, it kind of combines the ideas of preterism and futurism together. The prophecy begins in the time of the prophet and stretches down to the last days. And we can see very similar sorts of things said, in the text of Daniel, right? So in Daniel 8, we have clear references to Persia and Greece, things happening in the time of the prophets, but then at the appointed time, the end shall be. Very similar thing in Daniel 11, Persia and Greece, and the time of the end. So to me, the historicist school of thought, where the prophecy begins in the time of the prophet and stretches down through history to the very time of the end, the last days of Earth's history, fits best with the text itself. It doesn't force an understanding upon the text that is not there. All right, so a historicist literal approach to Daniel 11, this is where they are taking the the conflict between the north and the south in a more literal fashion, a more literal interpretation. Would see, again, Persia and Greece, kings of the north and south, being the Ptolemies and Seleucids in 5 to 13. In verses 14 to 35, they would see the king of the north being pagan Rome. Remember, we saw that the little horn and the king of the north, the same language is used to describe them. So they take that understanding and say the king of the north is pagan Rome and papal Rome, and that the king of the south is the Islamic Caliphate. We'll talk about that just a little bit. And that this back and forth war between north and south is really a description of the Crusades that happened during the Middle Ages between the papacy and the Islamic Caliphate, or the empire. So the last parts of this chapter are going to be interpreted as papal Rome usurping God's position and his authority, and then this final struggle between papacy and radical Islam. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, just to let you know this is where I fall. This is my best understanding of Daniel 11. I haven't always been here. At one time, I was more of a symbolic. I understood Daniel 11 in more of a symbolic fashion, but as I studied it more, this is what I believe to be the best interpretation. You might disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. Lots of people do, and that's okay. The historicist symbolic interpretation would see, again, Persia and Greece, verses 5 to 13, the rise of papal supremacy. 14 to 35, they would see the king of the north symbolizing papal Rome, king of the south symbolizing atheism. And this struggle between false religion and no religion. And so they interpret the conflicts between the king of the north and the south thematically. So, these wars in specific verses and the king of the south going here, all of that is just to give kind of a word picture of a conflict that goes back and forth. But to them, it's more of an ideological conflict and not a physical conflict. For them, the height of this war happens during the French Revolution, where you really did have these two worldviews clashing. The Enlightenment with kind of this atheistic, secular modernist thinking, and the papacy, that kind of old school way of approaching God and religion in the world. And this, of course, came to a head when Napoleon sends Berthier to Rome, captures the Pope, throws him in jail, he dies in prison, and, the temporal reign of the papacy comes to an end. So the way they interpret verses 40 to 45 is a final struggle between papacy and secularism and atheism. And again, they would say that God's people are caught in between, right? That neither of these are two good options, and that God's people are caught in the middle. So that's just kind of a little bit of an overview of different schools of thought. Again, currently where I'm at in, what's this, May 22, 2024, I fall in the historicist literal mode of interpreting Daniel 11. You may come to a different conclusion. That's perfectly fine. And what I'm going to do in the rest of our time is walk you down through not all of these different interpretations, but through the historicist literal interpretation, and show you why I believe what I believe and how I've come to that conclusion. Questions, comments, thoughts just about these different schools of thought? Okay. You don't have to remember all this and memorize this chart or anything. This is just to kind of give you a broad picture of how different people are approaching Daniel 11. Is that fair? Okay. All right. So, let's open Daniel 11 up. So we have looked at verses 1 through 4 of Daniel 11 already. Looked at Persia and those kings of Persia that are identified, the three more kings and then the king of Greece that arises. So we're going to look now at Daniel 11, verse 5. And we're not going to read we're going to read verse 5 and we're going to read verse 6, but we're not going to read all of verse 6 because verse 6 will really get into the weeds and we got to take it in just little bites that we can chew. All right. Everybody with me? By the way, the interpretation of Daniel, and particularly Daniel 11, that is found in the footnotes to this great prophetic books, is the historicist literal approach. And so my interpretation is largely, for the most part, going to agree with the notes that are found here. All right. So this is put out by Andrews University and Andrews University Press. This is they've got a study Bible. This is kind of the notes from that study Bible with in just the Daniel and Revelation section. And I think Roy Gain and Jacques Ducan are the ones who worked together to write the notes for the Daniel section. It was probably Stefanovic who worked for the Revelation section. All right. Let's read verse 5, and we'll read 6 all the way up to where it says the king of the north to make an agreement. Do you see where that is, Renee?
I'm sorry. Say
That's
that again.
okay. We're going to read Daniel 11, verse 5, and then we're going to stop halfway through verse 6, where it says, we'll end at where it says the king of the north to make an agreement.
Okay. So verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
Also the king of the south shall become strong as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement.
Okay. So just to kind of paint the picture here, we have this king of the south, and again, this it doesn't tell us, it doesn't really give us any context. It just says, king of the south, here they are. They're strong. One of his princes is going to gain power and have dominion, and his dominion's going to be, great dominion. And then it says, at the end of some years, they shall join forces. So it's talking about the king of the south, and one of the princes of the king of the south is going to have dominion, and it's going to have power over him. So it seems like one of the princes of the king of the south is not getting along with the king of the south, right? At the end of some years, the king of the south and his prince, shall join forces. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. So let me just try to walk you through here. We've got a king of the south and his prince that they're fighting. The prince is fighting against the king of the south. Prince is going to gain power. And then the king of the south and this prince are going to join forces through marriage. And notice, the marriage is when the king of the south, the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north. So this tells us, who is this prince? It's the king of the north, right? This prince that comes out of the king of the south and gains power, and then there's this opposition, and then there's this marriage, is the king of the north. Now, just kind of put that on a shelf in your brain for just a minute.
Okay, you figured that. So is this where they're trying to marry in between to gain?
So a lot of the way, peace was always fragile in the ancient world. It still is very fragile. It's very true. Good point. Peace is very fragile. And one of the ways that peace, that in the ancient world they would try to make peace, is that the idea that, blood is thicker than water.
Yes.
So if we're related, then we wouldn't possibly ever fight against each other, right? I mean, come on, that would never happen. And so let me send you my daughter, and then you'll marry my daughter, and, we'll be family. And this marriage will be a symbol of our alliance, our union, our peace that is between us. This happened all the time. It even happened up through we talked about this with Daniel chapter 2, up through in the Middle Ages, even almost, to the 1800s, this was happening in Europe, and so it's that sort of dynamic that's being talked about here. Using a marriage, sending a daughter to marry a king in order to forge an alliance or to forge peace. So, okay. So let's see if we can just start putting this puzzle together a little bit. Last time, we talked about the geography of the land of Israel. Remember, you've got Jerusalem right here, this yellow star. You've got these two highways going through the land of Judea, joining the continents of Africa and Eurasia. So, Judea is this land bridge between these masses. You've got the Arabian desert here. And so enemies that would come to Israel would come from the north or from the south, right? Now, during much of the Old Testament, those enemies from the north were Assyria and Babylon. And from the south, it was Egypt, right? Now, by the time Daniel 11 is being written, Assyria is gone, Babylon is gone, and Egypt is pretty much gone. So, as we are understanding these ideas of kings of the north and south, we need to understand the geography. But we're not talking literally about Assyria or Babylon or, the Egyptian empire of the pharaohs. Does that make sense? So, were there some powers that came into being that occupied these spaces of north and south with Israel situated in the middle? Absolutely. Absolutely. So what we're going to talk about is what happened right after Alexander the Great's death. So remember, in Daniel 11, 1-4, we've got these successive Persian kings, and then we skip over, we get to Xerxes. He stirs up, everybody against Greece, and then we skip from him up to this great king of Greece, Alexander the Great. He's going to be broken off. His kingdom is going to go, remember what it says? To the four winds, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be scattered. And we talked about how Alexander, he's there in Babylon, he's dying, he doesn't have an heir. Alexander, who gets the kingdom goes to the strongest. And that made for a lot of peace, right? Made for a lot of war. And so what happens is the generals all say, oh, that's me. I'm the strongest. Let me prove it. And so there's just this conflict, and this became known as the Wars of the Didochi, which literally means the successors, or the succession. So everybody's trying to take that place, an empire that Alexander, is leaving behind. So what comes out of this time period is really you have four generals that are established in four different parts of Alexander's empire. Okay, so you can see here the green, the blue, the pink, and the yellow. Again, Jerusalem is right here. So you have these four territories, and these four generals, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. They are going to be the ones that are carving out each a section of Alexander's empire. Now, we need to talk about the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. And can you see why? these are the successors, right, to Egypt and to, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Their territories land right where those empires used to be. Okay, so this is immediately after, Alexander the Great, this Hellenic period, this fighting. So, Ptolemy won Soter. And what we're going to see is we're actually going to see in the south, in this Egyptian area, we're going to see a series of kings named Ptolemy. You'll have Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II. You'll see a series of kings in the north that are either Seleucus or Antiochus, and you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4. So Ptolemy I Soter was a friend of Alexander the Great, and he was a general. He consolidated power in Egypt, okay? Seleucus won Nicator. He originally won part of this eastern section, but then was later driven out by another general. And guess where he goes when he's driven out? He goes down south and finds refuge with his good old buddy Ptolemy. So he's down there for a little while, and then Ptolemy says, hey, let me set you up with a kingdom of your own, right? So he's down there. Maybe he's playing a little bit of a princely role in Ptolemy's kingdom, but, he wants his own kingdom. He doesn't just want to, manage part of Ptolemy's kingdom. So Ptolemy enables and empowers him to go back and to reconquer this northern and eastern section of Alexander's empire, puts him, gives him an army, gives him his support, supplies and all of that. And Seleucus goes back and he conquers this northern section. So now we've got a king of the north and a king of the south. All right? So that's these two guys right here. But let's go back to Daniel 11, verse 5. Well, let me pause here. Questions just about generally what's going on here so far? Okay. All right. Let's go back to Daniel 11, verse 5 and 6. So the king of the south, verse 5 says, become strong. Well, that's what we know happens, right? Ptolemy gains this kingdom. He is established first, as well as one of his princes, okay? So I'm interpreting that one of his princes was Seleucus, who comes down here. He finds refuge. He's there in Ptolemy's kingdom, but he says, I don't want to just be a lower person here in your kingdom. I want a kingdom of my own. So Ptolemy gets him set up over here, and he ends up having, it says great dominion. So compared to all the other kingdoms, right, he's got the largest territory and dominion, okay? But what happens now is neither of these kingdoms, remember these roads that went through here? The Via Maris, the way of the sea, and the King's Highway, neither of these kingdoms control that trade route. They each only control part of it. And remember, trade is money, it's wealth, it's power. And so there starts to be a conflict between the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties. And what happens, initially, Seleucus, after Ptolemy sets him up, he wants to come back down to Palestine and Judea and take that territory for his own. And Ptolemy was like, hey, don't forget, you wouldn't even have a kingdom if it weren't for me, so back off. So Seleucus does. But that's not going to last all that long. So, I'm just trying to think about how to summarize this quickly. All right, let's do it this way. So, what happens is their children, Antiochus II, who's the next king in the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemy II, decide to make an alliance through the marriage of Ptolemy's daughter Bernice up to Antiochus. So Antiochus was already married, though. Well, that's not going to work. So he kicks his wife Laodice to the curb and takes Ptolemy's daughter, and now they're married. Everything's happy, okay? Well, Ptolemy dies, and Antiochus decides that he doesn't really want to be married to Bernice. He wants his first wife back, okay? So this is like soap opera drama in the ancient world. He wants his first wife back, but how does his first wife feel? Ripped off, right? I mean, she was just thrown to the curb. When it wasn't convenient to be married to her anymore, he takes this other wife. So when she comes back, all of a sudden, Antiochus drops dead.
Really?
Yes, this is what happens. Laodice comes back, and Antiochus drops dead, and historians are pretty sure that she had him poisoned. And then, as soon as Antiochus drops dead, Bernice and her children and all her court that are associated with her are killed, right? Now notice what the text here says. At the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. So far so good, but notice what the next thing says. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. Okay? So this is exactly what happens. Okay? But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. So basically all of that is saying those who supported this, Ptolemy II, Antiochus, Bernice, they're all going to meet their end, right? And this is exactly what happens, okay? Questions, comments, thoughts so far? We're kind of condensing down a lot of history. And again, this section of Daniel 11, almost all the schools of interpretation agree. It seems pretty clear and definite what's going on. All right. Sure. Yeah. No, so it's his first wife, Laodice. I think Laodice is probably how you say it. So he's married to her, but they need to make this alliance. So King of the South wants to send his daughter up, Bernice, to get married to him. But, we got to get rid of the first wife first. So she goes up there. But when dad dies, he's like, I don't want to stay married to her anymore. What's the point? Her dad's dead, and the alliance isn't there. So he tries to get rid of her, and then his first wife comes back, and he drops dead. Yep.
So how does this affect Jerusalem?
Good question. Very good question. So Stacy's question is, how does this affect Jerusalem? So what is happening here? This is prime real estate, because the corridor of transportation and trade goes through here. You can see this is where the kingdoms converge, right? And so this piece is going to last temporarily, but as soon as it's over, we're going to see that these armies are going up and down through Jerusalem, fighting for this territory and going through this territory to get at each other, right? So this is the front lines of the conflict between North and South.
But not necessarily against that area.
So they both were back and forth for the next few centuries fighting for control of that area. They very much, everybody wanted to control. Now, parts of northern Palestine, Galilee, that area was considered a breadbasket. It was very fertile. But even more than that, it's the trade routes that go through there, which controls access. And so this is contested and fought over real estate. And so the Jews are in this back and forth conflict during this time. Okay.
So this is after Daniel?
Yeah, this is.
He's dead?
Yeah, so this is. Okay, here we go. Right. This is after Daniel, before Christ. So Antiochus II, who I just talked about, that whole marriage Bernice thing, Ptolemy II. So we're, 260, 250s BC. So about, 200 or 300 years before Christ. So.
And Daniel was alive in the 400s.
So Daniel was alive
457.
in. He was carried captive in 605 BC.
605.
And stretches. Babylon falls in 539 BC. So that's kind of the time period that Daniel is living and operating in.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yep. Okay, so
Sharon, you understand, don't you?
so go with me to verse 7. Now remember, so you've got Bernice who doesn't retain her power and dies. That she's this princess pawn. And the one who begot her, is gone, meets his end. Verse 7, but from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. Okay?
So that her is Bernice.
That her, I believe, is Bernice. So what happens, we know from history. So remember, Antiochus is poisoned. Laodice has Bernice and all her family, children killed. Well, now Bernice's brother, his dad died. Bernice's father died. Bernice's brother is now on the throne. His sister has just been killed, by all those folks up north. He's not very happy about it. That's his sister. Those are, his nieces and nephews, her children. And so what he does is he gets together an army and marches up north and ravages and pillages the kingdom of the north. Notice what it says. He shall come with an army, enters the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And that's exactly what happens. So Ptolemy I goes up north. He prevails. Notice verse 8. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt. Now notice here, it doesn't just say to the south, it says to Egypt. So this lets us know that we're on the right track when we're interpreting the king of the south reigning over that region, right? Okay? Mm-hmm. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So what happens? He goes up north. He prevails against the king of the north, is successful with his army and his military campaign. He captures a bunch of the gods. Now remember, your God was your symbol of power, your peace, prosperity. If our gods are better than your gods, well, they're going to take your gods captive, right? And your gods can come and serve our gods in their temple. So he actually goes up to Egypt, and we have historical record that shows that he brought 2,500 gold and silver idols back from the north down south. That's a lot of idols, right? Now, Maybe many of these are household gods, right? So people have these little household gods that they worship at the altars, but these would also have been gods in temples and high places and all throughout the land. So they're going through the land, they're getting, the things that are valuable, but not just money, not just slaves and people, they're getting these gods and they bring them back. And we have a historical record of 2,500 of these gods being brought back. And this is, of course, exactly what Daniel 11 verse 8 says. Okay. So far, this isn't too bad, right? Seems to be fitting with history as we know it. And, up until now, most people are, most scholars are in agreement. All right. Because of the sake of time, I'm gonna do a little leapfrogging here, okay? So we've gotten all the way up through Ptolemy III and Antiochus II. Antiochus III is going to come on the throne. He will become known as Antiochus the Great. This is the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, the one that we've talked about, right? Okay, this is the father of Antiochus Epiphanes. These next verses, I think, describe this time period of the reign of Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III. You can read about some of that interpretation in the notes here in the book of Daniel, the great prophetic books. But what I want to do is, for the sake of time, I want to just jump with you. We're going to start leapfrogging some verses, okay? Because we got to go quick. We got a lot of weeds and not that much time. So let me go with you to verse 16. All right. So it's talking about the king of the north. Verse 15 is he's taking fortified cities of the south. And then it says, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will. This is the king of the north. And no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. Okay? What happens is Antiochus, let me go back to our little map here.
Yeah, that's helpful, that map.
Yeah, let me just jump here. Okay. Antiochus III, he becomes known as Antiochus the Great because he's more successful from a military perspective and also from a administrative perspective. So he conquers Palestine. So he conquers the land of Judea. Up until this time, the Ptolemies have mostly been in control of Judea. It's gone back and forth, but the Ptolemies have been, for the large part, in control. He's going to come down. He's going to conquer Judea, and never again will Judea fall under the reign of the Ptolemies, the king of the south. From this point on, up until Rome, Judea is going to be under the reign of the Seleucids, the king of the north. And this happens during the reign of Antiochus the Great. Okay? So I think verse 16, when it says he comes into the glorious land, obviously, it's Jerusalem, it's Israel, right? Mm-hmm. So this is him entering the possession of the land of Judea changes hands during his reign. All right. So let's leapfrog one more time. Well, not just one more time, actually. I lied. Sorry.
In church at that.
I know. We're going to skip 17, 18, 19, and we're going to head over to verse 20. Daniel 11, verse 20. If you'll read that for us, Renee.
There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in a battle.
Okay. So, the Hebrew here, and I think there might even be a footnote in this, where it says, "There shall arise a one in his place." It really is kind of has the connotation of like a change of regime. Like this is, this isn't just a successor rising, but this is, kingdoms, being shuffled around. And so there's going to arise in his place one who will impose, notice, taxes on the glorious land. This is actually a major clue for understanding what's going on. Glorious land, of course, is where? Is Israel. Taxes. Can you think of a regime or a kingdom or an empire that is going to impose taxes upon the land of Israel? Rome. In fact, the tension between the Jews and the Romans primarily is going to center on the issue of taxation. This is going to be the reason that after the time of Jesus, the Jewish wars are fought. It's because of this issue of taxation. So what happens? The kingdom of Rome is beginning to grow and expand, and they expand out of Italy, over to Greece and then down Asia Minor, and Pompey. So this is a famous general. We're going to talk about some of the drama that surrounds him. The town of Pompeii that is buried by the volcano. It's named after him. So he's going to come down, and he is going to conquer Palestine, right? So no longer are the Seleucids in charge of Israel. Rome, from about 64, 63 BC, is going to be in charge of the land of Israel. So that happens when he comes down, and of course, as soon as they conquer, what does Rome love to do? Impose taxes, right? So not only comes this conquest and possession of Palestine, of the land of Israel and Judea, but now also taxation comes along with it. Okay? All right. But notice with me, it says within a few days, so, think short time period, he's going to be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. So the one who's going to come, conquer, impose taxes is going to be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. Verse 21, and in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. I believe that this vile person that arises in Pompey's place, so I believe verse 20 is referring to Pompey coming down, conquering Israel, imposing taxes. 21, this vile person that arises in his place is, does anybody know the name? Julius Caesar. Okay, so let's just talk about what happens here in history. Julius Caesar was a man of ambition that is hard to even fathom. He is over in charge of the Roman armies over in France. He fights what are called the Gallic Wars with sheer brutality. I've read, even Caesar's account of what he does is just, it's brutal. He fights these wars, but as he's there fighting these Gallic wars, he reads about Alexander the Great. And he reads about how Alexander the Great, by the age of 30 or so, has conquered basically, the known world. And Julius Caesar starts weeping and crying because he says, I'm Alexander's age, and look what little I have conquered. I've only conquered all of France for Rome, I haven't conquered the entire world. So out of his ambition, Caesar goes back to Rome, with his troops that are very loyal to him. And he, there's this famous moment where he crosses the Rubicon. This was a psychological barrier, meaning the Roman generals were not supposed to bring their troops across. This is a safe zone. Remember, Rome at this time is not an empire, it's a republic with a representative form of government. So Caesar comes back with his armies. He crosses the Rubicon. Pompey is a consul. He's shared power, in this Republic of Rome with Caesar and somebody else. And, there's been this, power sharing. Pompey and the senators flee, and Caesar enters into Rome peaceably. There's not a fight yet, right? Now, all of this took a lot of political, behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Caesar was a genius at all of this, to make it happen. He's, counting the votes as he goes in and making sure that, who's going to resist me? Hey, you don't want to resist me. It will lead to your death, but if you join me, you will be rewarded really well. He's doing all this behind the scenes. He enters into Rome. Pompey and the senators flee, and basically a civil war ultimately is going to start. But Caesar takes a hold of Rome, initially without a fight. Caesar and Pompey, their armies clash. Pompey loses. He flees to that favorite place it seems like everybody wanted to flee to, down to Egypt, where the Ptolemies were, right? There's a little war going on down there. When he flees down to the Ptolemies in Egypt, he gets there, gets off his ship, and the Ptolemies kill him. Not because they don't like him, they actually like Pompey, but they can see the writing on the wall, and they see that Caesar is going to be the one running the show, and so they kill Pompey, and they send his head back to Caesar to try to win Caesar's favor. It's a brutal world, right? But Caesar is not pleased. Even though he and Pompey were fighting against each other, they were old allies and friends, and his plan was to, become Caesar, become dictator, but to spare Pompey. That's what he wanted. He didn't want Pompey to be killed. And so he actually has the people who killed Pompey, killed. He gives him a proper burial for someone of state there in Rome. And then now civil war is over. Caesar has his reins on, his hands on the reins of power. And famously, the people come to him and offer him a crown. Now remember, this has been a republic. They haven't had a king. They haven't had an emperor. They haven't had a Caesar. It's had a representative form of government. They come to Caesar, and there's this big show made offering Caesar a crown and saying, "Oh, Caesar, be our king, be our king." And Caesar just politely refuses. No. That's a little too, I wouldn't presume to take such titles upon myself. So he doesn't take the title king, but he becomes absolute dictator, right? So he's not a king, but there's no difference between him and an absolute monarch. Now go back with me. Notice what it says. Verse 20. There shall rise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious land, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. Okay, so this is Pompey. And in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. Now that's interesting, isn't it? But he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. I think all of that is a very good summary of Julius Caesar and how he comes into power. Questions, comments, thoughts? Now, if you were part of unlocking Daniel back in the digital-only age. The interpretation that I gave for verses 19 and 20 were a little bit different than this time. It varied a little more from the great prophetic books. Since then, I've just done a lot more reading and listening into Roman history, and I really think that 20 and 21 really fit the change of power to Pompey and then to Caesar. So. Okay. So, before that, I believed that Caesar was being referred to earlier on, verses 19 and in there. So it's basically, the interpretation is very similar, but it's just nudged a little bit. Yeah.
So, I'm in kindergarten compared to you, okay? So, but I'm trying to understand, Reed. So Daniel has this vision, and what he's interested in is the Jewish people and where life is going to go for them.
Yeah.
So you have Babylon, Medo Persia, then Greece with these 4 generals. And the 2 generals that become important to somebody like Daniel, looking down the future, are
Right.
the ones that are in the north and the south and have Jerusalem sandwiched in between. That's
Exactly.
why they're important.
Yes.
And so then we get into Rome, and you have the same situation where these 2 people have Jerusalem sandwiched in between.
Yeah.
And so that would be important to Daniel and his people, because he wants to know what's going to happen to the
Exactly.
city, what's going to happen to God, what's going to happen to his people.
Yeah, very well said, very well said. And that's, if you look at, sometimes the kingdoms in Daniel have been described as world empires. That's not actually true. None of them ruled the entire world. Every single one of them, though, ruled over the area where God's people were. That's the focus. That's why these empires are being talked about in the book of Daniel. And of course, Rome is going to be a very big deal for the Jews, right? I mean, this is huge for their fate and the fate of their people. In fact, let's go ahead and go there.
Well, the Jews were to be a light to the rest of the world. And they still were there, and Christ was going to come and be that light. He was positioned in the place where he would make a difference in the then known world.
Yeah.
The most powerful spot.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, very good. So notice with me what Renee has been summarizing so well here. We can see this happening in the very next verse, Daniel 11:22. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him. Now that they is very interesting. Who is the they? With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken. And also, notice this figure, the prince of the covenant. Now, we've seen this prince before, right? Remember Daniel 9? Messiah the prince, the one who confirms the covenant with God's people. This is Jesus, right? This is Jesus.
The answer to the problem
Yes.
of Daniel.
That's right. Exactly.
He's finally arriving on the scene.
And notice, so the prince of the covenant is going to be swept away. And then it says also, with the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken. This language here in Daniel 11, verse 23, is very reminiscent of Daniel 9. Go back with me.
So all this detail is giving us assurance that this is right.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And there, it doesn't spell everything out, but it gives us these little clues to hang our hats on.
Yeah, the big pieces, like if
Mhm.
we're talking about the United States, 9/11 and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, these are it. So
Cool.
Daniel 9:26. So remember, we've got in 11:23 this idea of the Prince of the Covenant, um, and then these people being swept away like a flood, right? They're going to be broken and swept away like a flood. It says, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Till the end of the war, desolations are determined. So here it's connecting again this idea of Messiah being cut off and the sanctuary of the city, its end coming with a flood. Daniel 11:23 is picking up on this language. And we know, it's at the hands of Rome. Tiberius Caesar is on the throne when Jesus is crucified, when he is cut off, but not for himself. And then, you've got, after Tiberius, you've got, Vespasian and these others who are, his son Titus, who are in charge when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And it's like a flood, it's swept away. I mean, think about, those stones up on the Temple Mount. We looked at those pictures, right? They are gone. And so I think by the time we're in verse 23, yes, we're in the time period of Rome. And verse 23 is very clearly referring to the death of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple at the hands of Rome.
And verse 27 says, and he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
is the prince of the covenant.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, questions, comments so far? That's cool.
Yeah.
So, did everybody hear Josh's comment? Josh said the Prince of the Covenant is right in the middle of Daniel chapter 11. So you've got 45 verses. Here verse 22, very end of 22 is this Prince of the Covenant. So boom, right in the middle of the chapter. That's pretty cool. Very cool observation. All right. So, is everybody with me so far? And again, we've had to skip some things, and we're going to have to start skipping a lot more if y'all want to go to bed tonight. So, let's keep rolling here. We're not going to get to the very end, but maybe we can in the next 10 or 15 minutes tie together one more piece of this puzzle. Okay. Verse 23, I believe, is another changing point in Daniel 11, right? So you have Rome, up through 21 and 22, at the hands of Rome, Jerusalem is destroyed, Prince of the Covenant dies. 23, after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. All right. Now, we're not, who is this he? Who are we talking about here, right? It just doesn't, it's like it starts mid-sentence almost, mid-idea. But notice what's happening. We have someone who is acting deceitfully. They're going to come up. They're going to start with a small number, and they're going to become strong. Now, does that sound like anything else we've talked about in the book of Daniel?
That little horn that gets bigger.
Yeah, right. So the little horn, remember, it comes up among the other horns.
Yes.
It's acting deceitfully. We see that in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. It's casting truth to the ground. It's causing deceit to prosper. It's acting deceitfully. It starts out small. Remember, it's a little horn. But remember, what does Daniel say? Daniel 8, it becomes very great. right? So we can't be talking about Rome here, right? Because the Roman Empire at this point was not small,
Yeah.
right? So we're talking about sometime after Jesus, after the destruction of the temple. The Roman Empire was not small. In fact, it was so big it was starting to fall apart. But there's something that's going to come up deceitfully, come up small. It's going to make leagues and, pacts and treaties, and it's going to gain power and become strong. So I believe this is talking about the little horn. This is talking about the little horn. This is the papacy, how Christianity comes and takes the spot of the Roman Empire. The Roman papacy comes and really takes that position of power from the Roman Empire as it's falling and crumbling. And so from this point onward, I believe that the king of the north here in Daniel 11 is referring to the Roman papacy. Now, when the Roman papacy, let me go back to my map here. When they take over power, they're out here in Rome, but remember, they're influencing the Roman Empire, and at that time, Jerusalem is still under that umbrella. But it's not going to stay that way for that much longer, okay? So let's keep reading here. All right, verse 23.
So what's going on in Jerusalem? The temple has been destroyed, all that.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting history. So what's that? So the Jews are scattered. They're not a nation. They fight a series of, not just the war in 70 AD, but, there's another rebellion, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, about 100 years later. So there's these series of wars between the Jews and Rome. And basically the Jews they're just a dispersed and scattered people. They have no homeland. They start spreading out even throughout Europe and other places. So there's no centralized location where the Jews have a center of power and authority. They are under the dominion of other powers wherever they are scattered throughout the world. So it existed for a period of time. The Romans forbade any Jews from being there. Eventually, they were able to come back. It was renamed for a period of time, and so it's not under Jewish. There's no temple there. There's no ruling priesthood, so it's not under Jewish control.
They were sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so for the sake of time, let me just read with you verse 25 here. Talking about this king of the north, who again I believe now is the Roman papacy. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. So if the king of the north from here on is the papacy, who is this king of the south? Well, the papacy really, remember we talked about it coming to power, kind of coming into its own, the 500s, 538, the Ostrogoths are kicked out. It kind of fills in that power vacuum in the crumbling Roman Empire. Well, not too long after the papacy comes into its political and spiritual power, further east, there is another empire that's going to be a religious political empire that is also going to come into power. And that's the Islamic Caliphate. So, 600s, you've got, the prophet Muhammad. He's down in what is today Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina. It's this religion, but it's not just a religion, right? There's this political ideology to, it's the counterpart to Christendom. It's, what becomes known as the caliphate. That is the empire ruled by the caliphs. They didn't have kings, but they were caliphs, is what they were called. And notice the expansion, right? So this is actually a map from the CIA that they use for their training purposes, as they're educating their people. So you've got, the red, is the initial, then the pink, and then the light pink. So they're expanding, right? So now, in the 600s, they are in charge of Jerusalem, this area. They push further west. So they're covering this whole area. And what's the empire to the north of them? Right? So you've got the Roman Empire that is crumbled apart, is broken apart, and the papacy is the one that is ruling really up here. You still have some of the Byzantine Empire over here. And now you have kind of this north-south dynamic between Christendom and the Islamic world. And what happens? Are the Christians very happy about this? No. I mean, this is the Holy Land, right? This is where, Jesus was, and, this is important to them from a religious perspective. And so, and by the way, of course, the Muslims build a mosque right there on top of the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock. So this is, that is very, focused, that piece of real estate. So as Christianity gains power, they launch a series of wars against the caliphate, known as the Crusades. So starting about, I think 1099 was the first crusade. They come in, and of course, what's the piece of real estate that they're fighting over? They're fighting over Jerusalem and Judea. And so the Crusaders come, and in fact, I've got a better map here. All right, so here you've got Christendom, what's called the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't really holy or Roman, maybe not even an empire per se, but that's what they called it, right? So you've got Caliphate, Holy Roman Empire. They're fighting these series of crusades, and the front lines is primarily going to be Jerusalem and Judea. The first crusade, they're going to go and they win it back. In fact, the first crusade is the most successful. So they win back the land of Jerusalem and Judea, but then there's going to be this back and forth between the two, for the next several hundred years. So this big picture is why I interpret from this time period onward, from verse 25 onward, I interpret the king of the south as referring to Islam and the caliphate. So again, you can see, they're down here in Egypt where, the Ptolemies were, but they've also all the way stretched up here, and then this is the land that's being fought over in the middle. So, questions, comments, thoughts about that? So, there's so many weeds that we don't have time to get into, but let me just read with you a few more verses. So we got the king of the south fighting back in 26, which we know is exactly what happens during the Crusades. Verse 27, both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will be at the appointed time. Now, I want you just to think with me a little bit about this time period. All right? So you've got the territory, the physical geography of Israel being fought over, but also from a spiritual perspective, God's people are really in the middle, right?
Always, it seems.
Yeah, always. Because, so, if you are a Christian who wants to follow Jesus and even read the Bible and study it on your own, you face persecution from the papacy if you lived in Christendom. But if you lived in the region of the caliphate and you were a Christian who wanted to read and study the Bible, you faced persecution from them. And these two religious political empires, I think they're more similar than different in a lot of ways, right?
Yes, they are.
So there's a religious ideology that is joined with political power, and they use force to enforce that religious ideology and to try to expand their kingdom and who is under their control. And, the Christians would come in. When they conquered Jerusalem and Judea during the First Crusade, they were killing Muslims and Jews, and it was kind of like kill them all and let God sort them out. That was kind of the idea. And I'm only partially joking there. I mean, that was really a mindset. And then the Muslims, when they gained power, I mean, in some ways they're bad, but they're not even quite as bad. A lot of times they would let Christians live if they just agreed to pay a tax because they were Christian. If you pay a special tax, sometimes they would force them at sword point to convert. A lot of times they would let them live if they just agreed to pay a tax and make their empire wealthy. You have this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in many ways, I see both the papacy and Islam as a distortion of true biblical religion.
Yes.
I mean, they actually both believe in Jesus. Now, Islam would say that he's not God, but that he is going to judge the world. They have a lot of similarities about the way that they practice religion, about the way that they view how it is that you are saved. Are there, the sacraments and the pillars of Islam? There's some similarities there. And so there's this back and forth, and where are God's people? They're caught in the middle. They're caught in the middle.
They're caught in the middle, but while they were fighting with each other, the Reformation was able to bloom. Isn't that correct?
There is, so in verse, 28? Let's read this actually.
Verse 28.
Yep. So the king of the north goes down and fights against the king of the south. And it says, while returning to his own land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenants. So shall he do damage and return to his own land. When the Christians came back from the Crusades, they came back with wealth and riches. And not just physical riches. They came back with what they thought were spiritual riches. So they might come back with a splinter that they said was a splinter from the cross, or an ankle bone that they would say was Peter's ankle bone. And then they would set these up in shrines, in churches and cathedrals all over Europe. And then people would come and make pilgrimages, right? Because if I could touch the ankle bone of Peter, or if I could touch a piece of the actual cross, then God will bless me. He will, take away, my sin and my sickness, and there will be, blessings that will come. And this was actually big business. These relics would be sold and purchased, because when you had them in your church, in your town, people would come and make pilgrimage, and there would be money that would be, there was money to be made. So these riches come back. But it was after the period of the Crusades, when the Reformation really started to get underway, that the more intense persecution of Christians who sought to live by the Bible started to happen. In fact, if you read with me down let's see. Well, let's see. Let's read verse 33.
33? Did you say 33?
Yep.
Okay. And those of the people
Yep.
who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame by captivity and plundering.
Okay.
That's the dark ages.
Yeah, this is really the Dark Ages. This is, the time of the Reformation. So it says those of understanding. Remember, it was called the Dark Ages because of the lack of understanding, right? But you have people like Huss and Wycliffe and Luther who are starting to read the Bible
Yes, the
and have a
king.
true understanding of how we are saved and what is God like, and these truths through his word, salvation by grace through faith, and they start understanding and instructing, right? Huss starts to preach. Luther nails, the 95 Theses, and he starts to preach. But what happens? Wycliffe publishes the Bible in English, so now people can read it, because the church had said, it has to be in Latin, and only those, who are trained in Latin and the priests can have the right to read it. Though the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Huss and others, they're burned at the stake, right? Killed by the sword, thrown into prison, goods confiscated. This is all happening, this fight. And if you read this whole section, the king of the north, he's blaspheming God. He's fighting against the Holy Covenant. He's doing all of these things. This is very clearly the persecutions of that little horn, that papal power. And back to Renee's point, there is some very interesting anecdotes in history where there was relief that actually came to some of those who were being persecuted during this time by the caliphate, sending armies, Portugal and Spain, and creating some distractions over on that side and other places. And so even though God's people were caught in the middle, there were moments where that, God used that to the advantage of his people and gave them a little breathing room.
And he does that, doesn't he? He uses wicked people to accomplish his purpose.
Yeah.
Did that for David when he was in Saul too.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's true.
He might get him off his tail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that happened with David.
So we're not going to, that's about as far as we're going to get, unfortunately. You've got some more weeds that you can go through on your own. If you want to check out the video from when we did this a couple years back, we got a little further then. But just a couple points as we close here. Remember, when the messenger came to Daniel, he said, "Now I've come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days." And we can see the flow of Daniel 11 is that God's people are caught in the middle, right? None of the kingdoms of this world are working for God's purposes and working for the purposes of those who are seeking God's kingdom. And I think the message is pretty clear in Daniel 11 that you can't align yourself with the king of the north or king of the south, right? Both these kings' hearts are bent on evil. And when we get to verses 40 through 45, this is talking about at the time of the end. We see these same powers. There's this back and forth. But ultimately, they will come to their end, right? Even though God's people are stuck in the middle, and for a long time, it seems like there are no good options and only evil is reigning no matter where you look. No matter who wins or loses, king of the north or king of the south, evil is reigning and winning. But that's not how it's always going to be. Go back with me to verse 27. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. Evil has an expiration date. The kingdoms of this world will be dust one day. And I think all of this is to let us know, let Daniel know, even though the time seems long, it seems to stretch out and be delayed and be almost beyond what we can endure, don't give up. Hold on. Keep seeking first the only kingdom that's going to last. Keep seeking first the only kingdom that is going to matter. There's only one king that's worth surrendering and submitting to and following with all your heart, putting your hope in, and that's the Son of Man, the Prince of the Covenant, the Messiah, Jesus, who is going to reign over that future kingdom. And so we can see this back and forth, but it all amounts to nothing. It all amounts to nothing.
I just I couldn't exist right now in this day and time without knowing these prophecies.
Amen.
They really take me through.
Yeah.
Because of what you just said.
Yeah. You know, if we thought that our hopes were pinned to what we see in the world around us, that the only good that we could expect to exist would be the good that we see happening at the behest of these earthly kingdoms. Well, that's a terrifying and depressing reality.
Yes, it is.
I mean, maybe we are a little more sheltered and blessed here, but go over to Gaza, go over to Ukraine, go over to Congo. And the reality of this, of Daniel 11, and the backward nature of the kingdoms of this world, it's evident. We can see it. And so let's not live for any of these kingdoms. We got to put all our hopes in Jesus and his kingdom. So, amen.
Yes, yes, yes.
All right, let's bow our heads for prayer. We'll close here. Thank you, God, for the hope that we have in Jesus.
Yes.
Forgive us for the times that we get distracted from it. Help us, Lord, to truly know what it means to seek you first. Thank you that you sought us first, that you came here while we were yet sinners, you died for us.
Yes.
And Lord God, may we do the same for you, by your grace, through your power and strength. Thank you for this time. Thank you most of all for Jesus. We pray this in his name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right.
That's why I came to study Daniel.
Amen. I love it.
This message.
I love it. It's good. It's hopeful.
It is. Absolutely.
Daniel 12. Last chapter. So you read Daniel 12, read the great prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation, 84 and 86. And we're going to spend a little time in Daniel 12 before we wrap up over at Mark and Donna's house and bring it all to a close. Yes, Joe.
Seem as if the king of the north wins at the end?
Okay. That's the part we didn't get to.
Oh, we're not going to do it next week?
No, we're not.
Oh,
We got two.
We can't leave off the end of the story.
All right. If anybody needs to leave, you can just slip out, and I won't even mind. All right. Daniel 11, verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, It's talking about the king of the south attacking the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. And it goes on to basically talk about the king of the north appearing successful, conquers and wins over the king of the south. But notice how Daniel 11 ends. But news from the east and from the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with a great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So he's mad, he's scared, he's troubled. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end.
Yay!
And no one will help him.
That's like the end of Daniel 2.
Yes, this is exactly like the end of Daniel 2. In fact, remember that stone, remember how it's described, the stone cut out without hands? That stone comes and smashes the image. It becomes dust, the wind blows it away. So literally when it says, he shall come to his end, and no one will help him, that's how it's translated. Literally it says, he shall come to his end without hand.
Oh.
It's very clearly a reference to that stone being cut out without a hand in Daniel 2. So yes, to answer your question, the king of the north does seem to reign supreme, and I think the book of Revelation picks up on this. Revelation 13, Revelation 17, we can see this, kind of this last hurrah of the king of the north, but they will come to their end. It will come to its end, not by human doing, but by God's hand, and not ours. So good question. Good question to end it on. Thank you.